My name is Dan. I'm also from Wix in Israel. I have to say that this is my first time in your beautiful country, and so far I'm enjoying myself very much. You have a really lovely country, and I hope to get here again, maybe to do another talk if this works out fine. So please be appreciative. The talk is about React and ES6. I have a confession to make. I am an ES6 fanboy, and I'm a React fanboy. So when I get to use both of them together, it's like when my head explodes. Let's start with a short poll though, however. How many people here know ES6 to some extent? Oh, that's a good number. Good on you. How many people know React? Okay, not everybody, but we can work with that. So as I said, my name is Dan. I've been with Wix for about almost 2 years now. I've been using JavaScript since way before then. But React I've only been using since joining Wix, which is not that surprising given that React itself is about 3 years old. So 2 years is about the reasonable time to be using React. And in fact, Wix, I think, is one of the first companies to be using React at large. And when I say at large, I mean really large. Our editor, for example, is several hundred thousand lines of code. I think about 500,000 lines of code, of React code. So that's a lot of React code. So if you're thinking about, can we build really big applications with React? The answer is yes. This number keeps changing every time I do a presentation. It says that 80 million here. It's actually 85 million now. So my job at Wix is a performance specialist, which means I work on making our own products and the products that drive the user's website faster. So really a good day for me is when I know that I made 85 million websites load and execute faster. And that's an impact, I think, that can be felt in the web. As I said, I've been using JavaScript for a long while and React a lot over the past 2 years. This is my Twitter account. I tweet a lot about JavaScript and development stuff. You're welcome to follow me. I really like it. And my email, in case you have any questions or comments or thoughts, feel free. So ES6, it's actually a bit confusing. What do I actually mean when I say ES6? Because if you've been following what's going on in the JavaScript world, there are a lot of terminology around the new versions of JavaScript. There's ES6 and ES7 and ES8 and ES 2015 and so forth. As far as I can tell, and it's a bit confusing, ES6 is the features beyond ES5 that have been ratified. Part of them have been ratified in 2015, and they are part of what is known as ES 2015, and part of them have been ratified in 2016, hence ES 2016. Chrome, Firefox, and Edge all support almost the entire ES6. This actual graph is from the Chrome blog. So as you can see, ES6, which is ratified, is supported, I think, to something like 95 to 99%. So we're really at ES6 these days. ES7, which is the candidate thing, is almost all supported as well in Chrome, which is really cool. And even some parts of ES8 are already supported. I won't be using all this fancy terminology, so I'll just be saying ES6. I mean everything that's beyond ES5. So I won't be exact, but it's just easier to say ES6 rather than trying to be exact and use the correct term all the time. So the purpose of ES6 is first and foremost to make it easier to use JavaScript for building applications with an emphasis on larger applications and more complex libraries. I mean, as the web front end and back end world develops, we're writing larger and larger, bigger and bigger applications using JavaScript, and we really hit some of the limitations of this language, stuff like lack of a module system. And some of these limitations have been addressed by external tools, stuff like Require or Browserify or now Webpack, but a lot of the stuff is like endemic, and you really, if you want to address it well, you need to address it from within the language and within the infrastructure itself. Another nice thing about ES6 is that it's more declarative, which means that instead of saying how I do something, I can say what I want to achieve. Kind of similar to what we were seeing in the previous talk about DSLs, about building blocks so that we can talk about the about the what rather than the how. Another thing is simply doing more with less. I don't know about you guys, but for me it's about a bug per line of code. So the fewer lines of code that I can write means fewer bugs that I have and a less debugging that I need to do. And finally, it's just a more pleasant coding experience. Every time that I have to move back to a project that still uses ES5, it's like, I hate this. I really want to use arrow functions and destructuring and stuff like that. Almost everything that you can do in ES6, you can do with ES5. I mean, you know, ES5 is Turing complete, so it's a programming language that can be used to write essentially any application. By the way, an interesting riddle for you guys to think about after this lecture is what can you do with ES6 that you can't do with ES5? Turns out that there are a few things. Not a lot, a few. So if I can do essentially everything or almost everything with ES5, what's the point of ES6? The point is that it's just so much more fun and pleasant and bug-free and so forth. So ES6 is unashamedly mostly about syntactic sugar, about having a nicer time of it when we're coding. And here are a few examples. So on the left-hand side, we see ES5 code, and on the right-hand side, we see the equivalent ES6 code. For example, if you're looking at the map function, at the map, converting an array of 1, 2, 3 into an array of what values? Anybody? Correct. So the answer is 2, 4, 6. We're essentially doubling all the values. Here's the old way, and on the right side, here's a new shorter way. By the way, function used to be the keyword that was the most common keyword, I think, in my code. And in ES6, it's essentially almost completely disappeared from my code. Saving a lot of repetitive typing. Here's another example of syntactic sugar which just makes the code more pleasant. Instead of writing x:x and y:y and width:width, I just write x, y, and width. It's essentially the same thing. It's just a nicer way to write it. And again, getting rid of the function keyword when I'm specifying area as a method within the object literal. Another example is specifying default parameter values. Everybody, I think, that has written any amount of JavaScript has used this paradigm of writing value equals value or something. And it's inside the code instead of being in the function signature where it should be. And it's just so much more pleasant to write value equals 42 in the function signature itself. The final one is kind of a tricky code and certainly a bit contrived. Basically, a reverse args takes a function and a list of arguments and then invokes the function with these arguments but in the reverse order. And it just shows how much more pleasant it is to use the spread operator instead of having to do with the really annoying arguments object, which is kind of like an array, but isn't really, and is really annoying and kind of stupid. And all of a sudden, the code looks much, much more simple and pleasant, and I think also readable once you get used to it. React. React, it turns out, has a lot of similarities to ES6, but let's talk about React itself first. So React is a JavaScript library. It's interesting that Facebook defines it as a library rather than as a framework for building user interfaces. You know, M.Sc is the kind of the ruling design pattern for building applications these days, and React specifies itself as being just the V in M.Sc. If you want the other parts, well, use Redux or some other Flux framework or whatever, or Relay, but React itself is just the V. There's a whole concept of virtual DOM. Since most of you guys have said that you know React, I won't go too deep into that. Basically, it's just a mechanism of rewriting the entire state on every change and having React itself be smart about how it updates the real browser DOM based on the changes in the virtual DOM. And it has this very nice one-way data flow where React, you like give data in and get UI out. And in an ideal world, you do it using pure functions, which make it very easy to grasp and understand, and also very straightforward to test. The purpose of React is to simplify UI state management and to be declarative, because you can use JSX as a means to just specify the HTML as a return value. It has really nice component composition, and it's high performance. And if we think about it, at least two of these points, we can see a really significant similarity to the purpose of ES6. The whole thing about simplifying stuff and about being more declarative. So we can see that there is sort of a similarity in purpose between what ES6 is trying to achieve and what React is trying to achieve. Even the component thing is about being able to build bigger applications. And as I said about ES6 with module systems and classes, is also being about being able to build bigger applications more easily. Also, in the same way that you could do almost everything with ES5 that you could do with ES6, everything you can do with React can be done without React. This is obvious. I mean, React is a library built on top of JavaScript and DOM. So you can just do JavaScript and DOM. So the value is that you can do without React. It's just that doing it with React is just faster and easier and much more fun. Given the similarities in purpose and approach, it's not that surprising that when you combine ES6 and React together, you get a really pleasant experience. Here are the similarities again. Easier to develop, more declarative. Oh, and another thing, Babel. Babel is another area of commonality between ES6 and React. Babel for ES6 basically compiles ES6 into ES5, allows you to use all the new and great modern features, and you target them at IE8 if that's what you really want to do. Babel also gets you JSX compilation. In fact, this is the recommended way by Facebook to compile JSX into straightforward JavaScript. So here you have the same tool servicing both these needs. And now it's time to do some live coding. And let's really hope it works for me. I've practiced a bit, but I'm also a bit tired. So if you notice me making a stupid mistake and getting stuck, again, please don't hesitate to point it out to me. So what do we have here? Basically, it's a very simple component implemented in React, which is just an arrow that switches direction every time you click on it. This might be something that you would use, let's say, with a sorted list of items or whatever. Let's look at the code together. So the HTML is really simple. It's just an empty HTML container, and the CSS isn't very interesting either. Let's make it slightly bigger. Is this big enough for everybody? Okay. You can see the sort button again switches direction when I click it. Let's look at the code quickly together. So root is where I'm going to be inserting the component. The component itself is called sort button. I'm defining it using create class. And finally, I'm just rendering it into the DOM. And by the way, if you haven't noticed, it says here I'm using Babel, which means that I'm getting it. That's what provides the JSX support, and also means that I can write whatever type of ES6 code I feel like and not have to worry about browser compatibility. Let's start ES6ing this code. So the first thing that I would do in many cases is basically just convert all the vars into consts. I like const much more than I like let, and I like both of them more than I like var, because they are blocked scoped, and if you use them and they're not hoisted, so if you use them before they're defined, you get a type exception. And you would declare them just in front of their use, just like in a normal programming language. and not up at the top of the function like you would do with var. So this is one change. Another change that I can immediately do is basically just delete all the function keywords because nobody really needs them here anymore. So already I've made the code a bit shorter and more robust. But you know what? When you have something called create class, that's a pretty strong indication that this should probably be a class. So let's convert this into an actual class. So is there a goal in the room next door? Okay. Now with class, you don't have the commas because, you know, and you don't need to have the closing parentheses. But it's still, there's a problem here because get initial state is not appropriate anymore. What we need now is a constructor. And now we need to invoke the super because we're inheriting from component. This is not the way to initialize state anymore. Constructors don't return a value. So instead, we just assign it directly into the state, like this. And is it done? Can you spot a problem with it? Will it work? It seems to render the initial thing properly. What will happen when I click the button, though? Oh, I have a syntax error. What did I miss? I missed something. Oh, yeah, the parentheses. Okay. Let's see, the error goes away. Yes. Okay. So now we saw it properly. So it rendered the initial state correctly. But if I try to click it, doesn't change. Do you know why? Yeah? Anybody? Raise your hand if you know. Okay, you? Correct. Unlike create class, which has automatic or implicit binding of the methods, with class, the React guys decided to be more in line with how JavaScript works. So in click handler, if we don't bind, because we're just passing it as a function, it will have the wrong this. So what I need to do is to bind. And now, it changes direction. But I don't like this code so much. I think it could be nicer. Let's start making it nicer. For example, I don't like to have this bind. It's really ugly. And one way that I can get rid of it is to basically just use an arrow function, because arrow functions are statically bound to the this of the containing function. So basically, I will just copy this block or cut it, and then here I'll just replace all of this with what I copied. And I can now delete this, and now it works. So because I'm using an arrow function, the arrow function doesn't have its own this. That's actually the way that it works. Instead, it gets the this from its containing closure, which has the correct this value because it's the render method that is invoked by React with the correct this value. Let's make this a bit nicer still. I don't like the fact that I keep writing this .state.ascending, so I'll use destructuring. And now the code becomes a lot shorter. In fact, so short that I can probably just fit it all inside one line. And likewise here, I don't need this .state anymore. Still working? Yes. And since we're going all out, let's go ES7. and use property initialization, which means that instead of having this constructor, I can just write this. And we're done. So now, still working? Yes. So now the whole code is 15 lines. Used to be here's the original implementation. It used to be 21 lines. So I've made it approximately 25% shorter. 25% less lines, 25% less typing, 25% less bugs. Since we're using Babel here, Babel actually compiles into ES5 code. So you're really dependent on the quality of compilation done by Babel. In this case, I actually think that performance-wise, in this code is simple enough and straightforward enough that for the code generated by Babel should be as good as the original ES5 code or close enough. If you're using actual ES6 support in the browsers themselves, the reality is that at present the optimizer doesn't optimize most functions that contain ES6 code, which means that using ES6 code directly in the browser generally results in JavaScript code that is 2 to 20 times slower than the equivalent ES5 code. But if you're looking at this kind of code that we have here, I'm very doubtful that your performance bottleneck would be the JavaScript. You're doing DOM stuff here. So the performance limitation would generally be DOM / rendering related rather than JavaScript. And if you really need to, you're doing some sort of complex calculation, move that into a separate function is probably a good thing to do anyway. And if you see that you have a performance problem in your application, then profile it. And if that's the function that actually is the bottleneck, then you can think about optimizing it and removing the ES6 stuff out of it because it's simply not performant enough. By the way, if I look at the compiled code, I will see that it's not putting in const. It's using var. You see, here's the var instead of const. So again, there's no performance overhead for using const, for example, in this case instead of var.
I want to be a little bit more specific on the performance side. The function you inline here in the on-click, I would be interested in looking at the compile code, because from how it is defined here, every call to render will return a DOM change, because there will be a new instance of this function, and the DOM in the browser will have to be updated. It's kind of
actually the function. Actually, that's not correct. That's it will be an interesting thing to check, but I actually disagree with you, because when you bind functions, it's actually not it doesn't go in the DOM. The way that React actually works is React doesn't bind directly doesn't attach event handlers to the components that it actually renders. It attaches an event handler at the root and then has its own internal dispatch mechanism. So when you modify an event handler on a React component, it doesn't actually need to re-render the DOM. The question wasn't that I'm still creating a new instance of the function on every render. That means it's kind of like doing the dot bind on every time instead of doing, let's say, just a bind in the constructor. Here, actually, ES6 would generate better code than Babel, because with ES6, arrows don't work using bind. Arrows just don't implement their own this. So it's like a variable that you don't define, and then it goes to the containing closure. Babel has to use bind because ES5 doesn't support this type of a construct. But if we were using ES6, and in this case, really ES6 would actually be more performant. As a performance specialist, I have to tell you though that in the vast majority of cases, code correctness is more important than performance. Don't worry about optimizing code before you know that you need to optimize that particular code. So you should not ignore performance issues completely. You shouldn't write code that has bad performance intentionally. But on the other hand, you should not worry about micro optimizations before you're actually found out and pinpointed the performance bottlenecks in your code. So what did we see? We saw that we use classes. Instead of using the create class, which was a React construct, we are using class, which is an ES6 JavaScript construct and is more natural as a result. In addition to that, we use arrow functions for event handlers, which work really well because of because they don't have their own this. We use the structuring for accessing, in this case, state, but it also works really well with props. And we use the ES7 property initializers. That's the thing where I put state equals the initial state instead of putting it in a constructor. Now let's look at another even more complex example, so it will give me even more chances to make stupid mistakes like having an accidental parenthesis. Let's go into the code directly, I think, because this is kind of small and difficult to see like that. So the component here is actually fairly silly. Basically, it's just I write some text and it gets added to a list that grows and grows. The JavaScript again, the HTML again is not really interesting, and there's no CSS at all in this case, so let's just look at the JavaScript together. Again, I'm taking the root, which I'm going to be rendering into, and the thing that I'm going to be rendering is the item list. So here's at the bottom you see I do react dom.render item list into root. Item list itself is a stateful component. The state is the list of items. I maintain that in item list. And it has two subcomponents: input, which is the input field, with the input area with the text field and the button, and output, which just displayed the list of the items. So far, so good. Any questions about this? So this is really a good example of using, or a simple example of using React components. Input, as I mentioned, is essentially just a component containing a form. I'm using it, doing a form, because then both clicking the button and pressing enter both work. So it's kind of a trick to get it to work both ways without having to intercept a lot of event handlers myself. By just handling the onSubmit, but I have to remember to prevent the default behavior for the submit. Fairly straightforward. I'm using the refs so that this component doesn't actually have its own state. Instead, it's using the state of the actual DOM input field, which it accesses using refs. And finally, here is the output, which is very simple and straightforward. Just a render function iterating over the items provided via props and writing every one of them into a list. Before we even get into ES6, it kind of makes sense to rewrite this using the new React stateless functional components. Are you familiar with the concept, people who use React? Basically, it's a means of, instead of doing it as a class, is doing it as implementing the component as a simple function which just takes value in and outputs UI out. Pure function, very easy to understand and very easy to test. Let's do that. Becomes a function. Receives the props. We don't need the create class anymore. Likewise, this entire line we don't need. And this goes away, and voila, here's the chain. Oh, and of course, you're not helping me. We don't need this here anymore. It's just props. Okay? Now, let's see if we can ES6 this function. So I'm going to change it into const because nobody should be changing this function after I defined it. It's going to be an arrow. Since I just return a value, I don't need all the code. I can just return. Likewise, the internal function just screams to become an arrow. I don't need the return again. Don't need this. Don't need the semicolon. If I'm missing something, I don't need this. Okay. This looks good. Does it work? Yes, it works. So here's the ES6 equivalent of the previous component that we had using create class. Now let's look at this one. This one also really wants to be a stateless functional component because it doesn't have state, but it does use this not only for props but also for refs. So I'll show you in a second how I can get rid of that. Let's start turning this into a stateless functional component. So const input except props. Sorry. Again, I don't need this. This one I'll turn into an internal function. Like so. And now we don't need this on the props. We will see what we do about the refs in a second. Render we don't need since it's just a function. So we return the result. And we can also do this, and this is gone. But we still have the problem. Oh, and in here, in the onSubmit, instead of doing this dot handle submit, it's just handle submit. But we still have a problem because we still have the this dot refs. So to get rid of that, I'll define, this time using let, a variable called input. And if, in case you don't know, ref, in addition to getting a name, can also get a function. And that function is invoked with the DOM element that was created. So I can just assign it into input. I can get rid of these parentheses if I really like shorthand. And finally, the only thing that I actually take from props is onChange. So I can use the structuring in the arguments to just take the onChange. And now I can get rid of props. And of course, here, instead of this dot refs, I just do input value. Any questions, comments?
Is there such a thing as like reverse babel?
Well, again, you can view, the question was, is there a reverse bubble? The answer is bubble generates JavaScript code. So
Conceptually, get from ES5 to ES6.
there's actually an interesting, the question was, is there an easy way to get from ES5 to ES6? And the answer is actually yes. There's a new project that I forget the name of, that takes ES5 code, applies certain heuristics, and generates ES6 code from it. So that kind of jump starts your transition of a project into ES6, saving you the effort of doing some of the manual changes. So there is such a project. I don't know how sophisticated it is. I never actually tried it, but I do know that it exists. I just don't remember its name off the top of my head. It doesn't say there's an error. Let's just verify that it's still working. Yes. Okay. And now, finally, let's look at the last one. This one is actually fairly similar to what we did in the previous exercise. It does need to be an actual class because it does have state. Again, I'll just initialize the state directly, like this. I can get rid of this. I don't need the add item anymore because this is really short, so I'll just grab all of this and inline it into the onChange. I'm getting an item back and I do something with it. And now I can get rid of add item. And I need to delete this. And is this correct? No, I still have an error somewhere. Oh yeah, I don't need this this is not the error, but I don't need this anymore. Probably, no, this state is okay, that's not the error. The error seems to have gone away. Let's see if it works. Yeah, it works. I'm still missing the structuring. Because I keep writing items all the time, which is annoying. So I'll destructure to extract items out of the state. And now I can just do items and items. Oh, and finally, because we have the spread operator, instead of using concat, I can write it like this. Does get a bit of getting used to, but it grows on you. So basically, I'm creating a new array which contains all the elements from items with a new item attached at the end. Let's see if it still works. The original code was 47 line long, as I remember. That's what I checked before, and now we're down to 36. Oh, I was down to 35, I think. I have some extra lines somewhere, which I maybe don't need. Never mind. In any event, it's approximately again a 25% reduction in the amount of lines of code, and moreover, I definitely think that if you're looking at something like the output, it's much simpler than it previously was. Any questions about this code? Oh, and I forgot, this needs to be const. Yeah, okay, now I'm happy with it, I think. Okay, moving on. So again, what did we do? We used stateless functional components. We used arrow functions for event handlers like before. We used the arrow for the ref. Instead of giving the ref a name, we used the function to get at the element directly. We used the structuring for accessing props. By the way, one more thing is, React has this really funky default props thing, which sometimes is really useful because you're doing, let's say, some sort of complex operation to calculate your props, so it makes sense to do it once in advance, but in a lot of cases I can just use default parameters like the ES6 default parameters. So let's say I want props to be able to work. Oh, here's the one thing I forgot, items. I should be destructuring for items. That's shorter. And now if I want output to be able to support, if you don't pass any value in, I wanted to just be an empty list, I can do something like this. And now, if output isn't, if you don't specify the items property for output, it will just assume an empty array, which is a nicer way of implementing default parameters than the default props. We've already seen how ES6 has influenced React. The React people at Facebook, the people working on the open source project, are seeing how JavaScript is evolving and are modifying React accordingly. For example, by adding support for classes. Instead of create class, being able to define it as a class and then extend it. It's interesting that there also appears to be some sort of an influence going back from React into JavaScript, into future versions of JavaScript. I mentioned the spread operator. So you've got, here's at the top, you see some examples of using spread operator with arrays. For example, AR becomes 1, 2, 3, 4 because we spread the 2 and 3 array into the middle of that array, and then we use it with destructuring. So first is equal to 1, second is equal to 2, and rest is an array containing 3 and 4, and I can even spread into an argument list. So spread inherently requires an object to implement an iterator. So you need to be able to get an iterator from an object to be able to spread it. I won't, this is not a talk about that, so I won't go too deeply. React was influenced by that by allowing you to use a spread operator on props, which basically duplicates props into a new object and lets you then override certain props attributes. So in this example, I wanted to pass all the properties into the internal component, but I wanted to overwrite foo, the original value of foo, which was same, with a value override. So I kind of clone the props and then I override the additional property on top of that. Makes it's much easier than having to specify all the properties independently, and also doesn't break encapsulation. But the spread here is applied to an object which is just a literal object. It doesn't really have an iterator. So it's not really, so the way that React implements it really has nothing to do with the ES6 spread operator except being influenced by the syntax. Well, it turns out that there is now a proposal to support spread over objects in JavaScript, even if they are don't provide an iterator, and essentially doing the exact same thing that the React spread operator does, essentially cloning the entire object or parts of the object. So we see here an interesting example of how ES6 influenced React, and then React apparently is influencing ES7. I won't do this. I don't have the time, and it's basically essentially just a repetition of the stuff that I did before, but you have the link to the presentation, so you can look at what this code does, try to figure it out, and then try to see if you can do the same thing that I did as an exercise for yourself. To summarize, the combination of ES6 and React together, I think, works really, really well. It makes me happy to use them together, and from my own personal experience, it's more fun to write code this way, and the code tends to have less bugs, and it's just cooler. So the question was, if we're transpiling the code anyway, why not go beyond just, let's say, ES6 and go to something like TypeScript? Which is an extension of JavaScript, including ES6. First of all, I have to say that it's interesting that originally one of the reasons that we all use JavaScript, or one of the best advantages of JavaScript, is that you could write code for the browser without having to compile. And all of a sudden we are compiling again. By the way, you don't really have to compile anymore, because if you're living in a world where you don't support the older browsers, essentially if you just need to support the evergreen browsers, with the possible exception of Safari, you can actually write just ES6 code, at least a significant subset of ES6. But you're correct. If I want to really be able to use everything without having to worry, I need to use something like Babel. What I can tell you about Wix is that we are at a bit of a crossroad about this. Approximately half of Wix is using TypeScript and half of Wix isn't. And there's a significant debate internally between TypeScript proponents and detractors. There are some people that think that static typing is amazing and great and prevents a bunch of errors, which is correct. On the other hand, there are a lot of people that saying that one of the beauties of JavaScript, let's say if you look at something like Redux, unless you have a really, really good type system like Elm, then it's really difficult to implement something like Redux in a language that the type system is not as good and enforces static typing. So a lot of people we have people internally that are worried about TypeScript causing junior JavaScript developers to essentially write JavaScript like they would write Java, with big hierarchies of classes and all sorts of type conversions and so forth. We're also looking at Flow, by the way, as another alternative option there of just getting static type checking without having something that is so opinionated about how you should be writing your code. So we're like I said, I don't have like a perfect answer for you about that.
If you would have to kickstart a new project, would you choose React, choose anything, or Angular 2? And why?
Well, the problem with Angular 2 is that it's not quite there yet, I think. Again, I can talk about Wix. Wix, we were very much an Angular shop, and then we got to a point where when we rebuilt the new editor, we did it with React, and we were really happy about it, and we really liked it a lot. So got to a certain interesting point in the company where half our stuff is built with Angular 1 and half the stuff is built with React. And now the people that are working in the Angular 1 are actually looking at React because they're kind of saying, first of all, Angular 2 is not here yet and it's not done yet. And it's going to force us to rewrite everything anyway and learn so much new stuff anyway. So we might as well just do it in React. So we seem to be in a slow process of transitioning from Angular to React. Personally, I like React because I really like the way the data flows, and I don't know enough about Angular 2 to really be sufficient to have a sufficiently good opinion about it. The question was, do we have experience of using Rx with React? The answer, personally, I really like reactive functional programming, although I find RxJX to be a bit much. It's just so big. But I really like the concept, and the times that I've played with it, I really enjoyed it. At Wix specifically, we're not using it.
You mentioned in your talk that there are things that you can do in ES6 but you cannot do in ES5. Can you show or say what are those things?
That was supposed to be a riddle. I'll give you the example. This is actually something that I'm thinking about, expanding on in a talk maybe sometime. But so I'll just give it I'll just list the items and you can look them up yourself. The ones that I'm aware of are proxy objects. You can't implement proxy objects. You need support from the actual JavaScript engine to be able to implement a proxy. You need what was the other? So there was proxy. There was, well, it's not so much of a feature, it's a capability. It's tail recursion. You can't do, either you have tail recursion or you don't. There's one I keep forgetting. Hopefully I'll remember in a second. I mentioned in the talk before about a function called, a new method called toPrimitive, which allows you to specify how objects transform into primitive types. You can kind of simulate it with toString to specify the transformation into a string, but you can't use toString to, let's say, return a string hello, but a number 42. And with toPrimitive, if you want to do something crazy like that, you can. And there was another one which I keep, which just escapes me right now. I'll probably remember in a few minutes. But here are a couple of examples. Okay, thank you everybody. I hope you enjoyed our meetup.